Andrew Johnson was the 17th President of the United States, serving from 1865 to 1869. Johnson became president as he was vice president at the time of the assassination of Abraham Lincoln, a Democrat who ran with Lincoln on the National Union ticket. Johnson came to office as the Civil War concluded. The new president favored quick restoration of the seceded states to the Union. His plans did not give protection to the former slaves, and he came into conflict with the Republican-dominated Congress, culminating in his impeachment by the House of Representatives, the first American president to be impeached. He was acquitted in the Senate by one vote. Johnson was born in poverty in Raleigh, North Carolina. Apprenticed as a tailor, he worked in several frontier towns before settling in Greeneville, Tennessee. He served as alderman and mayor there before being elected to the Tennessee House of Representatives in 1835. After brief service in the Tennessee Senate, Johnson was elected to the Federal House of Representatives in 1843, where he served 5 two-year terms. He became governor of Tennessee for 4 years, and was elected by the legislature to the Senate in 1857. In his congressional service, he sought passage of the Homestead Bill, which was enacted soon after he left his Senate seat in 1862. As Southern slave states, including Tennessee, seceded to form the Confederate States of America, Johnson remained firmly with the Union. He was the only sitting senator from a Confederate state who did not resign his seat upon learning of his state's secession. In 1862, Lincoln appointed him as military governor of Tennessee after most of it had been retaken. In 1864, Johnson, as a war Democrat and Southern Unionist, was a logical choice as running mate for Lincoln, who wished to send a message of national unity in his re-election campaign. Their ticket easily won. When Johnson was sworn in as vice president in March 1865, he gave a rambling speech, after which he secluded himself to avoid public ridicule. 6 weeks later, the assassination of Lincoln made him president. Johnson implemented his own form of presidential reconstruction. A series of proclamations directing the seceded states to hold conventions and elections to reform their civil governments. When Southern states returned many of their old leaders, and passed black codes to deprive the freedmen of many civil liberties, congressional Republicans refused to seat legislators from those states and advanced legislation to overrule the Southern actions. Johnson vetoed their bills, and congressional Republicans overrode him, setting a pattern for the remainder of his presidency. Johnson opposed the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to former slaves. In 1866, Johnson went on an unprecedented national tour promoting his executive policies, seeking to destroy his Republican opponents. As the conflict between the branches of government grew, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act, restricting Johnson's ability to fire cabinet officials. When he persisted in trying to dismiss Secretary of War Edwin Stanton, he was impeached by the House of Representatives, and narrowly avoided conviction in the Senate and removal from office. Returning to Tennessee after his presidency, Johnson sought political vindication, and gained it in his eyes when he was elected to the Senate again in 1875, the only former president to serve there. Just months before his death, Johnson is regarded by many historians as one of the worst presidents in American history. While some admire his strict constitutionalism, his strong opposition to federally guaranteed rights for African Americans is widely criticized. Early life and career. Childhood. Andrew Johnson was born in Raleigh, North Carolina, on December 29, 1808, to Jacob Johnson and Mary Polly McDonough, a laundress. He was of English, Scottish, and Irish ancestry. Johnson's mother apprenticed her son William to a tailor. James Selby. Andrew also became an apprentice in Selby's shop at age 10 and was legally bound to serve until his 21st birthday. Johnson lived with his mother for part of his service, and one of Selby's employees taught him rudimentary literacy skills. Johnson was not happy at James Selby's, and after about 5 years, both he and his brother ran away. Selby responded by placing a reward for their return. $10 reward. Ran away from the subscriber. 2 apprentice boys, legally bound, named William and Andrew Johnson, moved to Tennessee. Johnson left North Carolina for Tennessee, traveling mostly on foot. After a brief period in Knoxville, he moved to Mooresville, Alabama. In Greeneville, Johnson established a successful tailoring business in the front of his home. In 1827, at the age of 18, he married 16-year-old Eliza McCardle, the daughter of a local shoemaker. The pair were married by Justice of the Peace Mordecai Lincoln, first cousin of Thomas Lincoln, whose son would become president. The Johnsons were married for almost 50 years and had 5 children: Martha, Charles, Mary, Robert, and Andrew Jr. Though she suffered from tuberculosis, Eliza supported her husband's endeavors. She taught him mathematics skills and tutored him to improve his writing. Johnson's tailoring business prospered during the early years of the marriage, enabling him to hire help and giving him the funds to invest profitably in real estate. Political rise. Tennessee politician. Johnson helped organize a mechanics' workingmen's ticket in the 1829 Greeneville municipal election. He was elected town alderman, along with his friends Blackston McDaniel and Mordecai Lincoln. In 1835, Johnson made a bid for election to the floater seat which Greene County shared with neighboring Washington County in the Tennessee House of Representatives. According to his biographer, Hans L. Treffaus, Johnson demolished the opposition in debate and won the election with almost a 2-to-1 margin. Afterwards, he was often addressed or referred to by his rank. In his first term in the legislature, which met in the state capital of Nashville, Johnson did not consistently vote with either the Democratic or the newly formed Whig Party, though he revered President Andrew Jackson, a Democrat and Tysian. The major parties were still determining their core values and policy proposals. With the party system in a state of flux, the Whig Party had organized in opposition to Jackson, fearing the concentration of power in the executive branch of the government. Johnson differed from the Whigs as he opposed more than minimal government spending and spoke against aid for the railroads, while his constituents hoped for improvements in transportation. After Brookins Campbell and the Whigs defeated Johnson for re-election in 1837, Johnson would not lose another race for 30 years. In 1839, he sought to regain his seat, initially as a Whig, but when another candidate sought the Whig nomination, he ran as a Democrat and was elected. From that time he supported the Democratic Party and built a powerful political machine in Greene County. In 1840, Johnson was selected as a presidential elector for Tennessee, giving him more statewide publicity. Although Democratic President Martin Van Buren was defeated by former Ohio Senator William Henry Harrison, Johnson was instrumental in keeping Tennessee and Greene County in the Democratic column. Congressman. Having served in both houses of the state legislature, Johnson saw election to Congress as the next step in his political career. He engaged in a number of political maneuvers to gain Democratic support, including the displacement of the Whig postmaster in Greeneville, and defeated Jonesboro lawyer John A. Aiken by 495 votes to 892. Johnson believed, as did many Southern Democrats, that the Constitution protected private property, including slaves, and thus prohibited the federal and state governments from abolishing slavery. In the presidential election of 1848, the Democrats split over the slavery issue, and abolitionists formed the Free Soil Party, with former President Van Buren as their nominee. Johnson supported the Democratic candidate, former Michigan Senator Lewis Cass. With the party split, Whig nominee General Zachary Taylor was easily victorious and carried Tennessee. Johnson's relations with Polk remained poor. The president recorded of his final New Year's reception in 1849 that, "Among the visitors I observed in the crowd today was Hon. Andrew Johnson of the Hoe. Reps. Johnson, due to national interest in new railroad construction and in response to the need for better transportation in his own district, also supported government assistance for the East Tennessee and Virginia Railroad." In his campaign for a fourth term, Johnson concentrated on three issues: slavery, homesteads, and judicial elections. He defeated his opponent, Nathaniel G. Taylor, in August 1849, with a greater margin of victory than in previous campaigns. When the House convened in December, the party division caused by the Free Soil Party precluded the formation of the majority needed to elect a speaker. Johnson proposed adoption of a rule allowing election of a speaker by a plurality. Some weeks later others took up a similar proposal, and Democrat Howell Cobb was elected. Once the speaker election had concluded and Congress was ready to conduct legislative business, the issue of slavery took center stage. Northerners sought to admit California, a free state, to the Union. Kentucky's Henry Clay introduced in the Senate a series of resolutions, the Compromise of 1850, to admit California and pass legislation sought by each side. Johnson voted for all the provisions except for the abolition of slavery in the nation's capital. A group of Democrats nominated Landon Carter Haynes to oppose Johnson as he sought a fifth term. The Whigs were so pleased with the internecine battle among the Democrats in the general election that they did not nominate a candidate of their own. The campaign included fierce debates. Johnson's main issue was the passage of the Homestead Bill. Haynes contended it would facilitate abolition. Johnson won the election by more than 1,600 votes. Governor of Tennessee. If Johnson considered retiring from politics upon deciding not to seek re-election, he soon changed his mind. Tennessee's governor had little power. Johnson could propose legislation but not veto it, and most appointments were made by the Whig-controlled legislature. Nevertheless, the office was a bully pulpit that allowed him to publicize himself and his political views. Although the Whig Party was on its final decline nationally, it remained strong in Tennessee, and the outlook for Democrats there in 1855 was poor. Feeling that re-election as governor was necessary to give him a chance at the higher offices he sought, Johnson agreed to make the run. Meredith P. Gentry received the Whig nomination. A series of more than a dozen vitriolic debates ensued. The issues in the campaign were slavery, the prohibition of alcohol, and the nativist positions of the Know-Nothing Party. Johnson favored the first, but opposed the others. Gentry was more equivocal on the alcohol question, and had gained the support of the Know-Nothings, a group Johnson portrayed as a secret society. When the presidential election of 1856 approached, Johnson hoped to be nominated. Some Tennessee county conventions designated him a favorite son. His position that the best interests of the Union were served by slavery in some areas made him a practical compromise candidate for president. He was never a major contender. The nomination fell to former Pennsylvania Senator James Buchanan, though he was not impressed by either. Johnson campaigned for Buchanan and his running mate, John C. Breckinridge, who were elected. Johnson decided not to seek a third term as governor, with an eye towards election to the U.S. Senate. In 1857, while returning from Washington, his train derailed, causing serious damage to his right arm. This injury would trouble him in the years to come. United States Senator. Homestead Bill advocate. The victors in the 1857 state legislative campaign would, once they convened in October, elect a United States Senator. Former Whig Governor William B. Campbell wrote to his uncle, "The great anxiety of the Whigs is to elect a majority in the legislature so as to defeat Andrew Johnson for senator. Should the Democrats have the majority, he will certainly be their choice, and there is no man living to whom the Americans." Johnson gained high office due to his proven record as a man popular among the small farmers and self-employed tradesmen who made up much of Tennessee's electorate. He called them the plebeians. He was less popular among the planters and lawyers who led the state Democratic Party, but none could match him as a vote-getter. After his death, one Tennessee voter wrote of him, "Johnson was always the same to everyone. The honors heaped upon him did not make him forget to be kind to the humblest citizen." Quote, the new senator took his seat when Congress convened in December 1857. The term of his predecessor, James C. Jones, had expired in March. He came to Washington as usual without his wife and family. Eliza would visit Washington only once during Johnson's first time as senator. In 1860, Johnson immediately set about introducing the Homestead Bill in the Senate, but as most senators who supported it were Northern, many associated with the newly founded Republican Party, the matter became caught up in suspicions over the slavery issue. Southern senators felt that those who took advantage of the provisions of the Homestead Bill were more likely to be Northern non-slaveholders. The issue of slavery had been complicated by the Supreme Court's ruling earlier in the year in Dred Scott v. Sanford that slavery could not be prohibited in the territories. Johnson, a slaveholding senator from a southern state, made a major speech in the Senate the following May in an attempt to convince his colleagues that the Homestead Bill and slavery were not incompatible. Nevertheless, Southern opposition was key to defeating the legislation. 22. Johnson continued his opposition to spending, chairing a committee to control it. He argued against funding to build Washington, D.C.'s infrastructure, stating that it was unfair to expect state citizens to pay for the city's streets, even if it was the seat of government. He opposed spending money for troops to put down the revolt by the Mormons in Utah Territory, arguing for temporary volunteers as the United States should not have a standing army. Secession Crisis. In October 1859, abolitionist John Brown and sympathizers raided the federal arsenal at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, today West Virginia. Tensions in Washington between pro- and anti-slavery forces increased greatly. Johnson gave a major speech in the Senate in December, decrying Northerners who would endanger the Union by seeking to outlaw slavery. The Tennessee senator stated that all men are created equal from the Declaration of Independence did not apply to African Americans, since the Constitution of Illinois contained that phrase, and that document barred voting by African Americans. Johnson hoped that he would be a compromise candidate for the presidential nomination as the Democratic Party tore itself apart over the slavery question. Busy with the Homestead Bill during the 1860 Democratic National Convention in Charleston, South Carolina, he sent two of his sons and his chief political advisor to represent his interests in the backroom deal-making. The convention deadlocked, with no candidate able to gain the required two-thirds vote, but the sides were too far apart to consider Johnson as a compromise. The party split, with Northerners backing Illinois Senator Stephen Douglas while Southerners, including Johnson, supported Vice President Breckinridge for president, with former Tennessee Senator John Bell running a fourth-party candidacy and further dividing the vote. The Republican Party elected its first president, former Illinois Representative Abraham Lincoln. The election of Lincoln, known to be against the spread of slavery, was unacceptable to many in the South. Although secession from the Union had not been an issue in the campaign, talk of it began in the Southern states. Johnson took to the Senate floor after the election, giving a speech well received in the North. "I will not give up this government. No, I intend to stand by it. And I invite every man who is a patriot to rally around the altar of our common country, and swear by our God, and all that is sacred and holy, that the Constitution shall be saved, and the Union preserved." Quote. Johnson returned home when his state took up the issue of secession. His successor as governor, Isham G. Harris, and the legislature organized a referendum on whether to have a constitutional convention to authorize secession. When that failed, they put the question of leaving the Union to a popular vote. Despite threats on Johnson's life and actual assaults, he campaigned against both questions, sometimes speaking with a gun on the lectern before him. Although Johnson's eastern region of Tennessee was largely against secession, the second referendum passed, and in June 1861, Tennessee joined the Confederacy. Believing he would be killed if he stayed, Johnson fled through the Cumberland Gap, where his party was in fact shot at. He left his wife and family in Greeneville. As the only member from a seceded state to remain in the Senate and the most prominent Southern Unionist, Johnson had Lincoln's ear in the early months of the war. Military governor of Tennessee. Johnson's first tenure in the Senate came to a conclusion in March 1862 when Lincoln appointed him military governor of Tennessee. Much of the central and western portions of that seceded state had been recovered, although some argued that civil government should simply resume once the Confederates were defeated in an area. Lincoln chose to use his power as commander-in-chief to appoint military governors over Union-controlled southern regions. As military governor, Johnson sought to eliminate rebel influence in the state. He demanded loyalty oaths from public officials, and shut down all newspapers owned by Confederate sympathizers. Much of eastern Tennessee remained in Confederate hands, and the ebb and flow of war during 1862 sometimes brought Confederate control again close to Nashville. However, the Confederate allowed his wife and family to pass through the lines to join him. When Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation in January 1863, declaring freedom for all slaves in Confederate-held areas, he exempted Tennessee at Johnson's request. The proclamation increased the debate over what should become of the slaves after the war, as not all Unionists supported abolition. Johnson finally decided that slavery had to end. He wrote, "If the institution of slavery seeks to overthrow it." Vice President. In 1860, Lincoln's running mate had been Maine Senator Hannibal Hamlin. Vice President Hamlin had served competently, was in good health, and was willing to run again. Nevertheless, Johnson emerged as running mate for Lincoln's re-election bid in 1864. Lincoln considered several war Democrats for the ticket in 1864, and sent an agent to sound out General Benjamin Butler as a possible running mate. In May 1864, the President dispatched General Daniel Sickles to Nashville on a fact-finding mission. Although Sickles denied he was there either to investigate or interview the military governor, Johnson biographer Hansel Treffaus believes Sickles' trip was connected to Johnson's subsequent nomination for vice president. To sound a theme of unity, Lincoln in 1864 ran under the banner of the National Union Party, rather than the Republicans. Although it was unusual at the time for a national candidate to actively campaign, Johnson gave a number of speeches in Tennessee, Kentucky, Ohio, and Indiana. He also sought to boost his chances in Tennessee while re-establishing civil government by making the loyalty oath even more restrictive, in that voters would now have to swear they opposed making a settlement with the Confederacy. The Democratic candidate for president, George McClellan, hoped to avoid additional bloodshed by negotiation, and so the stricter loyalty oath effectively disenfranchised his supporters. Lincoln declined to override Johnson, and their ticket took the state by 25,000 votes. Congress refused to count Tennessee's electoral votes, but Lincoln and Johnson did not need them, having won in most states that had voted, and easily secured the election. 1865 cartoon showing Lincoln and Johnson using their talents as rail splitter and tailor to repair the Union. Now Vice President-elect, Johnson was anxious to complete the work of re-establishing civilian government in Tennessee, although the timetable for the election of a new governor did not allow it to take place until after Inauguration Day, March 4. He hoped to remain in Nashville to complete his task, but was told by Lincoln's advisors that he could not stay, but would be sworn in with Lincoln. In these months, Union troops finished the retaking of eastern Tennessee, including Greeneville. Just before his departure, the voters of Tennessee ratified a new constitution, abolishing slavery, on February 22, 1865. One of Johnson's final acts as military governor was to certify the results. Johnson traveled to Washington to be sworn in, although according to Gordon Reed, in light of what happened on March 4, 1865, it might have been better if Johnson had stayed in Nashville. Quote, in the weeks after the inauguration, Johnson only presided over the Senate briefly, and hid from public ridicule at the Maryland home of a friend, Francis Preston Blair. When he did return to Washington, it was with the intent of leaving for Tennessee to re-establish his family in Greeneville. Instead, he remained after word came that General Ulysses S. Grant had captured the Confederate capital of Richmond, Virginia, presaging the end of the war. President. Accession. On the afternoon of April 14, 1865, Lincoln and Johnson met for the first time since the inauguration. Trefow states that Johnson wanted to induce Lincoln not to be too lenient with traitors. Gordon Reed agrees. Contemporary woodcut of Johnson being sworn in by Chief Justice Chase as cabinet members look on. April 15, 1865. That night, President Lincoln was shot and mortally wounded by John Wilkes Booth, a Confederate sympathizer. The shooting of the president was part of a conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln, Johnson, and Seward the same night. Seward barely survived his wounds, while Johnson escaped attack as his would-be assassin, George Atzerodt, got drunk instead of killing the vice president. Leonard J. Farwell, a fellow boarder at the Kirkwood House, awoke Johnson with news of Lincoln's shooting at Ford's Theater. Johnson rushed to the president's deathbed, where he remained a short time, on his return promising, "They shall suffer for this. They shall suffer for this." Quote, the events of the assassination resulted in speculation, then and subsequently, concerning Johnson and what the conspirators might have intended for him, in the vain hope of having his life spared after his capture. Atzerodt spoke much about the conspiracy, but did not say anything to indicate that the plotted assassination of Johnson was merely a ruse. Conspiracy theorists point to the fact that on the day of the assassination, Booth came to the Kirkwood House and left one of his cards. This object was received by Johnson's private secretary, William A. Browning, with an inscription, "Are you at home? Don't wish to disturb you. J. Wilkes Booth." Quote, Johnson presided with dignity over Lincoln's funeral ceremonies in Washington, before his predecessor's body was sent home to Springfield, Illinois, for burial. Reconstruction Background. Upon taking office, Johnson faced the question of what to do with the Confederacy. President Lincoln had authorized Loyalist governments in Virginia, Arkansas, Louisiana, and Tennessee as the Union came to control large parts of those states and advocated a 10% plan that would allow elections after 10% of the voters in any state took an oath of future loyalty to the Union. Congress considered this too lenient. Its own plan, requiring a majority of voters to take the loyalty oath, passed both houses in 1864, but Lincoln pocket vetoed it. Johnson had three goals in Reconstruction. He sought a speedy restoration of the states, on the grounds that they had never truly left the Union, and thus should again be recognized once loyal citizens formed a government. To Johnson, African American suffrage was a delay and a distraction. It had always been a state responsibility to decide who should vote. Second, political power in the Southern states should pass from the planter class to his beloved plebeians. Johnson feared that the freedmen, many of whom were still economically bound to their former masters, might vote at their direction. Johnson's third priority was election in his own right in 1868, a feat no one who had succeeded a deceased president had managed to accomplish, attempting to secure a Democratic anti-congressional Reconstruction coalition in the South. The Republicans had formed a number of factions. The Radical Republicans sought voting and other civil rights for African Americans. They believed that the freedmen could be induced to vote Republican in gratitude for emancipation, and that black votes could keep the Republicans in power and Southern Democrats, including former rebels, out of influence. They believed that top Confederates should be punished. The moderate Republicans sought to keep the Democrats out of power at a national level, and prevent former rebels from resuming power. They were not as enthusiastic about the idea of African American suffrage as their radical colleagues, either because of their own local political concerns, or because they believed that the freedmen would be likely to cast his vote badly. Northern Democrats favored the unconditional restoration of the Southern states. They did not support African American suffrage, which might threaten Democratic control in the South. Presidential Reconstruction. Johnson was initially left to devise a Reconstruction policy without legislative intervention, as Congress was not due to meet again until December 1865. Johnson's first Reconstruction actions were two proclamations, with the unanimous backing of his cabinet. On May 29, one recognized the Virginia government led by Provisional Governor Francis Pierpont. The second provided amnesty for all ex-rebels except those holding property valued at $20,000 or more. It also appointed a temporary governor for North Carolina and authorized elections. Neither of these proclamations included provisions regarding black suffrage or freedmen's rights. The president ordered constitutional conventions in other former rebel states. As Southern states began the process of forming governments, Johnson's policies received considerable public support in the North, which he took as unconditional backing for quick reinstatement of the South. While he received such support from the white South, he underestimated the determination of Northerners to ensure that the war had not been fought for nothing. It was important, in Northern public opinion, that the South acknowledge its defeat, that slavery be ended, and that the lot of African Americans be improved. Voting rights were less important. After all, only a handful of Northern states, mostly in New England, gave African American men the right to vote on the same basis as whites. And in late 1865, Connecticut, Wisconsin, and Minnesota voted down African American suffrage proposals by large margins. Northern public opinion tolerated Johnson's inaction on black suffrage as an experiment, to be allowed if it quickened Southern acceptance of defeat. Instead, white Southerners felt emboldened. A number of Southern states passed black codes, binding African American laborers to farms on annual contracts they could not quit, and allowing law enforcement at whim to arrest them for vagrancy and rent out their labor. Most Southerners elected to Congress were former Confederates, with the most prominent being Georgia Senator-designate and former Confederate Vice President Alexander Stephens. Congress assembled in early December 1865. Johnson's conciliatory annual message to them was well received. Nevertheless, Congress refused to seat the Southern legislators and established a committee to recommend appropriate Reconstruction legislation. Northerners were outraged at the idea of unrepentant Confederate leaders, such as Stevens, rejoining the federal government at a time when emotional wounds from the war remained raw. They saw the Black Codes placing African Americans in a position barely above slavery. Republicans also feared that restoration of the Southern states would return the Democrats to power. Radical Reconstruction. Even with the Republican victory in November 1866, Johnson considered himself in a strong position. The 14th Amendment had been ratified by none of the Southern or border states except Tennessee, and had been rejected in Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland, as the amendment required ratification by 3/4 of the states to become part of the Constitution. He believed the deadlock would be broken in his favor, leading to his election in 1868. Once it reconvened in December 1866, an energized Congress began passing legislation, often over a presidential veto. This included the District of Columbia voting bill. Congress admitted Nebraska to the Union over a veto, and the Republicans gained 2 senators, and a state that promptly ratified the amendment. Johnson's veto of a bill for statehood for Colorado Territory was sustained. Enough senators agreed that a district with a population of 30,000 was not yet worthy of statehood to win the day. In January 1867, Congressman Stevens introduced legislation to dissolve the Southern state governments and reconstitute them into 5 military districts. Under martial law, the states would begin again by holding constitutional conventions. African Americans could vote for or become delegates. Former Confederates could not. In the legislative process, Congress added to the bill that restoration to the Union would follow the states' ratification of the 14th Amendment, and completion of the process of adding it to the Constitution. Johnson and the Southerners attempted a compromise, whereby the South would agree to a modified version of the amendment without the disqualification of former Confederates, and for limited black suffrage. The Republicans insisted on the full language of the amendment, and the deal fell through. Although Johnson could have pocket vetoed the first Reconstruction Act as it was presented to him, less than 10 days before the end of the 39th Congress, he chose to veto it directly on March 2, 1867. Congress overruled him the same day. Also on March 2, Congress passed the Tenure of Office Act over the president's veto. In response to statements during the swing around the circle that he planned to fire cabinet secretaries who did not agree with him, this bill, requiring Senate approval for the firing of cabinet members during the tenure of the president who appointed them and for 1 month afterwards, was immediately controversial, with some senators doubting that it was constitutional or that its terms applied to Johnson, whose key cabinet officers were Lincoln holdovers. Impeachment. The situation. A Harper's Weekly editorial cartoon shows Secretary of War Stanton aiming a cannon labeled Congress to defeat Johnson. The rammer is Tenure of Office bill, and cannonballs on the floor are Justice. Secretary of War Edwin Stanton was an able and hard-working man, but difficult to deal with. The new Congress met for a few weeks in March 1867, then adjourned, leaving the House Committee on the Judiciary behind, charged with reporting back to the full House whether there were grounds for Johnson to be impeached. This committee duly met, examined the president's bank accounts, and summoned members of the cabinet to testify. When a federal court released former Confederate President Davis on bail on May 13, he had been captured shortly after the war. The committee investigated whether the president had impeded the prosecution. It learned that Johnson was eager to have Davis tried. A bipartisan majority of the committee voted down impeachment charges. The committee adjourned on June 3. Later in June, Johnson and Stanton battled over the question of whether the military officers placed in command of the South could override the civil authorities. The president had Attorney General Henry Stanbury issue an opinion backing his position that they could not. Johnson sought to pin down Stanton, either as for, and thus endorsing Johnson's position, or against, showing himself to be opposed to his president and the rest of the cabinet. Stanton evaded the point in meetings and written communications. When Congress reconvened in July, it passed a Reconstruction Act against Johnson's position, waited for his veto, overruled it, and went home. In addition to clarifying the powers of the generals, the legislation also deprived the president of control over the army in the South. With Congress in recess until November, Johnson decided to fire Stanton and relieve one of the military commanders, General Philip Sheridan, who had dismissed the governor of Texas and installed a replacement with little popular support. He was initially deterred by a strong objection from Grant. On August 5, the president demanded Stanton's resignation. The secretary refused to quit with Congress out of session. Grant, under protest, followed Johnson's order transferring Sheridan and another of the district commanders, Daniel Sickles, who had angered Johnson by firmly following Congress's plan. The president also issued a proclamation pardoning most Confederates, exempting those who held office under the Confederacy, or who had served in federal office before the war and had breached their oaths. Although Republicans expressed anger with his actions, the 1867 elections generally went Democratic. No seats in Congress were directly elected in the polling, but the Democrats took control of the Ohio General Assembly, allowing them to defeat for re-election one of Johnson's strongest opponents, Senator Benjamin Wade. Voters in Ohio, Connecticut, and Minnesota turned down propositions to grant African Americans the vote. Johnson notified Congress of Stanton's suspension and Grant's interim appointment. In January 1868, the Senate disapproved of his action and reinstated Stanton, contending the president had violated the Tenure of Office Act. Grant stepped aside over Johnson's objection, causing a complete break between them. Johnson then dismissed Stanton and appointed Lorenzo Thomas to replace him. Stanton refused to leave his office, and on February 24, 1868, the House impeached the president for intentionally violating the Tenure of Office Act. By a vote of 128 to 47, the House subsequently adopted 11 articles of impeachment, for the most part alleging that he had violated the Tenure of Office Act, and had questioned the legitimacy of Congress. Theodore R. Davis's illustration of Johnson's impeachment trial in the United States Senate, published in Harper's Weekly. On March 5, 1868, the impeachment trial began in the Senate and lasted almost 3 months. Congressmen George S. Boutwell, Benjamin Butler and Thaddeus Stevens acted as managers for the House, or prosecutors, and William M. Evarts, Benjamin R. Curtis and former Attorney General Stanbury were Johnson's counsel. Chief Justice Chase served as presiding judge. Johnson maneuvered to gain an acquittal. For example, he pledged to Iowa Senator James W. Grimes that he would not interfere with Congress's Reconstruction efforts. Grimes reported to a group of moderates, many of whom voted for acquittal, that he believed the president would keep his word. Johnson also promised to install the respected John Schofield as War Secretary. With the deal-making, Johnson was confident of the result in advance of the verdict, and in the days leading up to the ballot, newspapers reported that Stevens and his radicals had given up. On May 16, the Senate voted on the 11th article of impeachment, accusing Johnson of firing Stanton in violation of the Tenure of Office Act once the Senate had overturned his suspension. 35 senators voted guilty, and 19 not guilty, thus falling short by a single vote of the two-thirds majority required for conviction under the Constitution. 7 Republicans, Senators Grimes, Ross, Trumbull, William Pitt Fessenden, Joseph S. Fowler, John B. Henderson, and Peter G. Van Winkle, voted to acquit the president, with Stevens bitterly disappointed at the result. The Senate then adjourned for the Republican National Convention. Grant was nominated for president. The Senate returned on May 26 and voted on the second and third articles, with identical 35-19 results. Faced with those results, Johnson's opponents gave up and dismissed proceedings. Allegations were made at the time and again later that bribery dictated the outcome of the trial, even when it was in progress. Representative Butler began an investigation, held contentious hearings, and issued a report, unendorsed by any other congressman. Butler focused on a New York-based Astor House group, supposedly led by political boss and editor Thurlow Weed. This organization was said to have raised large sums of money from whiskey interests through Cincinnati lawyer Charles Woolley to bribe senators to acquit Johnson. Butler went so far as to imprison Woolley in the Capitol building when he refused to answer questions, but failed to prove bribery. Foreign policy. Soon after taking office as president, Johnson reached an accord with Secretary of State William H. Seward that there would be no change in foreign policy. In practice, this meant that Seward would continue to run things as he had under Lincoln. Seward and Lincoln had been rivals for the nomination in 1860. The victor hoped that Seward would succeed him as president in 1869. At the time of Johnson's accession, the French had intervened in Mexico, sending troops there. While many politicians had indulged in saber-rattling over the Mexican matter, Seward preferred quiet diplomacy, warning the French through diplomatic channels that their presence in Mexico was not acceptable. Although the president preferred a more aggressive approach, Seward persuaded him to follow his lead. In April 1866, the French government informed Seward that its troops would be brought home in stages, to conclude by November 1867. Seward was an expansionist, and sought opportunities to gain territory for the United States. By 1867, the Russian government saw its North American colony, today Alaska, as a financial liability, and feared losing control as American settlement reached there. It instructed its minister in Washington, Baron Edouard de Steckel, to negotiate a sale. De Steckel did so deftly, getting Seward to raise his offer from $5 million. Coincidentally, the minimum that Russia had instructed de Steckel to accept, to $7 million, and then getting $200,000 added by raising various objections. Another treaty that fared badly was the Johnson-Clarendon Convention, negotiated in settlement of the Alabama claims for damages to American shipping from British-built Confederate raiders, negotiated by the United States Minister to Britain, former Maryland Senator Reverdy Johnson. In late 1868, it was ignored by the Senate during the remainder of the president's term. The treaty was rejected after he left office, and the Grant administration later negotiated considerably better terms from Britain. Administration and Cabinet. Replaced ad interim by Ulysses Grant in August 1867 before being reinstated by Congress in January 1868. Judicial appointments. Johnson appointed 9 Article III federal judges during his presidency, all to United States District Courts. He did not appoint a justice to serve on the Supreme Court. In April 1866, he nominated Henry Stanbury to fill the vacancy left with the death of John Catron, but Congress eliminated this seat to prevent the appointment. and to ensure that he did not get to make any appointments eliminated the next vacancy as well, providing that the court would shrink by one justice when one next departed from office. Reforms initiated. In June 1866, Johnson signed the Southern Homestead Act into law, believing that the legislation would assist poor whites. Around 28,000 land claims were successfully patented. Although few former slaves benefited from the law, fraud was rampant, and much of the best land was off-limits, reserved for grants to veterans or railroads. Completion of term. Johnson sought nomination by the 1868 Democratic National Convention in New York in July 1868. He remained very popular among Southern whites, and boosted that popularity by issuing, just before the convention, a pardon ending the possibility of criminal proceedings against any Confederate not already indicted, meaning that only Davis and a few others still might face trial. On the first ballot, Johnson was second to former Ohio Representative George H. Pendleton, who had been his Democratic opponent for vice president in 1864. Johnson's support was mostly from the South, and fell away as the ballots passed. On the 22nd ballot, former New York Governor Horatio Seymour was nominated, and the president received only 4 votes, all from Tennessee. The conflict with Congress continued. Johnson sent Congress proposals for amendments to limit the president to a single 6-year term, and make the president and the Senate directly elected, and for term limits for judges. Congress took no action on them. When the president was slow to officially report ratifications of the 14th Amendment by the new Southern legislatures, Congress passed a bill, again over his veto, requiring him to do so within 10 days of receipt. He still delayed as much as he could, but was required, in July 1868, to report the ratifications making the amendment part of the Constitution. Seymour's operatives sought Johnson's support, but he long remained silent on the presidential campaign. It was not until October, with the vote already having taken place in some states, that he mentioned Seymour at all, and he never endorsed him. Nevertheless, Johnson regretted Grant's victory, in part because of their animus from the Stanton affair. In his annual message to Congress in December, Johnson urged the repeal of the Tenure of Office Act and told legislators that had they admitted their Southern colleagues in 1865, all would have been well. He celebrated his 60th birthday in late December with a party for several hundred children, though not including those of President-elect Grant, who did not allow his to go. On Christmas Day 1868, Johnson issued a final amnesty, this one covering everyone, including Davis. He also issued, in his final months in office, pardons for crimes, including one for Dr. Samuel Mudd, controversially convicted of involvement in the Lincoln assassination. He had set Booth's broken leg, and imprisoned in Fort Jefferson on Florida's Dry Tortugas. On March 3, the president hosted a large public reception at the White House on his final full day in office. Grant had made it known that he was unwilling to ride in the same carriage as Johnson, as was customary, and Johnson refused to go to the inauguration at all. Despite an effort by Seward to prompt a change of mind, he spent the morning of March 4 finishing last-minute business, and then shortly after noon rode from the White House to the home of a friend. Post-presidency. After leaving the presidency, Johnson remained for some weeks in Washington, then returned to Greeneville for the first time in 8 years. He was honored with large public celebrations along the way, especially in Tennessee, where cities hostile to him during the war hung out welcome banners. He had arranged to purchase a large farm near Greeneville to live on after his presidency. Some expected Johnson to seek to be Tennessee's governor again or to attempt to return to the Senate. Others that he would become a railroad executive. In 1873, Johnson contracted cholera during an epidemic, but recovered. That year he lost about $73,000 when the First National Bank of Washington went under, though he was eventually repaid much of the sum. Johnson's comeback garnered national attention, with the St. Louis Republican calling it the most magnificent personal triumph which the history of American politics can show. Death. Johnson returned home after the special session concluded in late July. Convinced some of his opponents were defaming him in the Ohio gubernatorial race, he decided to travel there to give speeches. He began the trip on July 28 and broke the journey at his daughter Mary's farm near Elizabethton, where his daughter Martha was also staying. That evening he suffered a stroke, but refused medical treatment until the next day, when he did not improve and 2 doctors were sent for from Elizabethton. He seemed to respond to their ministrations, but suffered another stroke on the evening of July 30th, and died early the following morning at the age of 66. President Grant had the painful duty of announcing the death of the only surviving past president. Northern newspapers, in their obituaries, tended to focus on Johnson's loyalty during the war, while Southern ones paid tribute to his actions as president. Johnson's funeral was held on August 3 in Greeneville. Historical view and legacy. According to Castell, historians, the turn of the 20th century saw the first significant historical evaluations of Johnson. Leading the wave was Pulitzer Prize-winning historian James Ford Rhodes, who wrote of the former president, "Johnson acted in accordance with his nature. He had intellectual force, but it worked in a groove. Obstinate rather than firm, it undoubtedly seemed to him that following counsel and making concessions were a display of weakness. At all events, from his December message to the veto of the Civil Rights Bill, he yielded not a jot to Congress. The moderate senators and representatives, who constituted a majority of the Union Party, asked him for only a slight compromise. Their action was really an entreaty that he would unite with them to preserve Congress and the country from the policy of the radicals. His quarrel with Congress prevented the readmission into the Union on generous terms of the members of the late Confederacy. His pride of opinion, his desire to beat, blinded him to the real welfare of the South and of the whole country." Rhodes ascribed Johnson's faults to his personal weaknesses, and blamed him for the problems of the postbellum South. Even as Rhodes and his school wrote, another group of historians was setting out on the full rehabilitation of Johnson, using for the first time primary sources such as his papers, provided by his daughter Martha before her death in 1901, and the diaries of Johnson's Navy Secretary, Gideon Welles, first published in 1911. The resulting volumes, such as David Miller DeWitt's The Impeachment and Trial of President Andrew Johnson, presented him far more favorably than they did those who had sought to oust him. In James Schuyler's 1913 History of the Reconstruction Period, the author accused Rhodes of being quite unfair to Johnson, though agreeing that the former president had created many of his own problems through inept political moves. These works had an effect. Although historians continued to view Johnson as having deep flaws which sabotaged his presidency, they saw his Reconstruction policies as fundamentally correct. Beale wondered in 1940, "Is it not time that we studied the history of Reconstruction without first assuming, at least subconsciously, that carpetbaggers and Southern white Republicans were wicked, that Negroes were illiterate incompetents, and that the whole white South owes a debt of gratitude to the restorers of white supremacy?" Quote, earlier historians, including Beale, believed that money drove events, and had seen Reconstruction as an economic struggle. They also accepted, for the most part, that reconciliation between North and South should have been the top priority of Reconstruction. In the 1950s, historians began to focus on the African American experience as central to Reconstruction. They rejected completely any claim of black inferiority, which had marked many earlier historical works, and saw the developing civil rights movement as a second Reconstruction. Some writers stated they hoped their work on the postbellum era would advance the cause of civil rights. These authors sympathized with the radical Republicans for their desire to help the African American, and saw Johnson as callous towards the freedmen. In a number of works from 1956 onwards by such historians as Von Brody, the former president was depicted as a successful saboteur of efforts to better the freedmen's lot. These volumes included major biographies of Stevens and Stanton. In the early 21st century, Johnson is among those commonly mentioned as the worst presidents in U.S. history. We know the results of Johnson's failures: that his preternatural stubbornness, his mean and crude racism, his primitive and instrumental understanding of the Constitution stunted his capacity for enlightened and forward-thinking leadership when those qualities were so desperately needed. At the same time, Johnson's story has a miraculous quality to it. The poor boy who systematically rose to the heights, fell from grace, and then fought his way back to a position of honor in the country. For good or ill, only in America, as they say, could Johnson's story unfold in the way that it did. In 2002, historian Castell took a stern view of Johnson's presidency, saying Johnson suffered from serious defects of mind and character. Quote,